Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Luzanne Lottering and I'm the Marketing Manager here at Cardiolog Analytics, and I'm very happy that I'm joined today by Microsoft MVP and Teams and SharePoint expert Hilton Giseno, and I will go ahead and kick things off. So today's webinar, we will teach you how SMBs can use Microsoft Teams as an intranet. Let's begin with a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded, and if you want to share this with a colleague, we will go ahead and send an email with the recording after today's session. And of course, if you have any questions, please send them through the questions box within the GoToWebinar panel, and we will leave some time towards the end for Q&A. And you can also connect with us on Twitter with the Twitter handle @Cardiolog. In regards to the agenda for today's webinar, we will start out with a very short introduction. I will talk a bit about Cardiolog Analytics and who we are, and then I will hop straight into those demo environments and show you Cardiolog Analytics' capabilities in Microsoft Teams, and also walk you through how you can not only track user activity, but also how to leverage our engagement solution to encourage users to use Teams and take advantage of the features that Hilton will discuss with us later. And then Hilton will go ahead, introduce himself, and dive deeper into today's topic, beginning with the why, what, and how of an intranet, Teams history and this context to date, and also looking at alternative approaches to Teams intranets, and also how to implement them and examining subportals in Teams as well. And at the end, we will be taking some Q&A, so feel free to send your questions throughout the course of this presentation. So I'll start off with a very brief introduction about Cardiolog Analytics and who we are. Cardiolog Analytics has been around for about 16 years now, since 2005. We are based out of Boston, and over the past 16 years, we've been focused on analytics and engagement designed for SharePoint, for Teams, for Office 365. And our flagship solution is Cardiolog Analytics, and it's built specifically for internal platforms, including all versions of SharePoint from 2010 to 2019, as well as SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, OneDrive Exchange, and soon also Microsoft Viva, which Hilton will talk a little bit more about today. Our solution is available both on-prem as well as a SaaS version based on Power BI. So let's hop straight into the demo. The Microsoft Teams portal is a streamlined central hub through which users can access messaging, conferencing, file sharing, calendars, and many, many more. But what does that mean if users are not taking advantage of that? So while Microsoft Teams can boost workplace collaboration in many ways, tracking the usage and driving users to take advantage of it and adopting it is where the real difficulty mostly lies. With Cardiolog Analytics' long list of Teams reports across many dashboards, I will show you some high-level Teams data on how organizations are using Teams and how this data can help drive users to take full advantage of this platform. So in this particular overview dashboard, we are seeing data about Teams usage. So what's really nice here is that we can see who our top teams are and also how active each top team is, to really give a good benchmark of what a productive or what a successful team looks like for you. So you can also see here the last activity date. So if, for example, your users haven't been active in the last 30 days, you can reach out to them, let them know that they have access to Teams, let them know about the amazing features, or maybe if they haven't responded, you can archive those teams to give some training, or maybe give some training to those teams. So it really depends on what your goal is and how you want to take action based on this data. If we hop quickly into engagement overview, so in order to monitor usage, you have to review reports to also understand emerging trends. For example, if we look here at, let's say, access type, This usage report shows that not many users are using a certain device to access Teams, for example. So this may then indicate that these users are not sure how to do so. So now we know and we can take action based on this. So maybe I can now post a step-by-step installation instructions for that specific device that I can see here. And that will help drive usage of a wider device range. And the same here if we look at private chat messages versus public chat messages. And this usage report shows that users are primarily, or sometimes we can see maybe only using Teams for Teams messages. But if it was the other way around, then you may want to review your Teams scenarios, because then users are maybe chatting outside of those initial teams and initial channels that were set up for them. So by having these valuable insights, you can reach out to your users to change their behavior and change the user behavior in order for them to be more productive and to be more collaborative and take advantage of those great features. If I hop into quickly team overview, what's really great about this dashboard once it finishes to load is that we can really, if we say for example we want to see data about a specific team, in this case I've selected the management team, we can choose which team I want to report on, and this data only reflects that particular team. And I can also do the same if I wish to drill down deeper into a specific channel. I can also select which channel into that team I want to see data of. If we talk more about users, in this dashboard you can see down to the user level, and obviously with this information you can drive adoption by finding out who your influential users are, who these champions are. And you can see here who's using Teams the most. Obviously these champions are the ones using Teams the most based on who's starting threads and who's sending channel messages and replying and liking and who is taking the most action. So once you know who these champions are, you can maybe now reach out to them, invite them to share some tips, maybe host a quick session explaining some how-tos on using Teams in order to motivate and support those inactive users. You can see which users are more active, and you can filter that by, like I said, the number of members, channels, messages, replies, and you can go even into more depth here and sort this by office. You can sort this by department even. And what's really great about that, you get really good insights on how different locations and how different groups are using Teams and what their top level of activity looks like. And then let's not forget content, also extremely important, especially considering today's topic. So for each team and channel, you can see if they are sharing content in tabs or if they are sending attachments. So if a customer wants to maybe give training for Teams and we know a specific team isn't sharing content, they might not know even that it's a functionality. So when we train, we know where to focus our training. It's very important to track users' productivity within Teams to ensure that users are, again, using all of the functionalities in Teams and not just using it as a chat-based platform, but actually using it to be productive and being collaborative. Now I want to quickly hop into the engagement part, Cardiolog Engage, whilst it's busy loading, because I want to show you how this amazing tool uses all these insights and data that I've shown you to take action to drive productivity and to drive collaboration and the consumption in all of the different platforms, obviously in this case particularly Teams, and to get those valuable insights directly from users. So here in the goals section, there are two main ways in which you can use the tool. You can create a new campaign from scratch where you can define the audience. Let's just do it completely from scratch. I can show you exactly how to use this tool. So if I, for example, seen in the data that there are users who did not interact with Microsoft Teams ever, or maybe in the last 30 days, obviously those are the users that are not using this platform to its full potential, to its full capability. So these are the users I want to reach out to. I want to remind them that they have access to Teams. I want to maybe send them a link, remind them about new features, tell them about capabilities, maybe send them a training manual, remind them of a training session, whatever the case may be. So I can send it to very specific users those inactive ones, and I'm not bombarding everyone with this message. Maybe I want to send a message to users who belong to a specific team. I've noticed that the marketing team are lagging in terms of Teams activity, and they are not using this platform to its full potential, so I want to reach out to them. So how am I reaching out to them? Maybe they are in the sales team, they're out in the field all day, so maybe a quick text message with a link back to Teams. Maybe they're very active in SharePoint but not in Teams, and I can send them a message that will pop up as a header or footer right on the SharePoint page with a link back to Teams or a reminder about a new feature in Teams which will help them be more productive or collaborative. Maybe a quick email, or what is better than driving them to the Teams platform, to send them a message right within Teams. It will show up as a channel message right within Teams. So you can design what the text will look like. You can say, I've noticed that you haven't been very active. Here's some training. Here's a guide on those installation instructions for that specific device that we mentioned earlier. Maybe I want to invite them to training, then I can ask them to RSVP. Maybe I want, like I said, I'm asking them a question, why, how can I assist you in order to be more productive in the Teams platform, and in that case it could be an open question. So based on the data you see, you know what action to take to drive productivity and collaboration in Teams. And then the last step will be the trigger. Do I want to send this message immediately? Do I want to schedule it to be sent at a specific date or time? Or, which is really neat, you can trigger it based on the behavior. So maybe when they are performing a search, or maybe when they are viewing a specific page in SharePoint. So this is based on the behavior in SharePoint. Whatever action you decide that they have to take will then trigger this message to be sent to them. And that is really neat. So making sure that the right message goes to the right user based on their action or their lack of action in Teams will then drive the user behavior that you want. So now I will hand it over to Hilton to show you why it will benefit your organization to drive Teams activity, and how by doing that you can effectively use Microsoft Teams as an intranet.
Great, thanks. Hey everybody. I'm going to turn the webcam off in a minute just because we want to focus more on, hopefully, on the content than my face for radio, shall we say. But I just want to put it on for a minute so everybody can see that I'm a real person and I'm here. But I want to say welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining on. Lizanne, thanks for the introduction and for taking us through Cardiolog. It's a very interesting tool, and we use it quite effectively with a number of our customers. That's why I'm glad to join with you guys for the webinar today. All right, perfect. So yeah, I'm very excited to share with you today a number of my favorite and most passionate topics together. SharePoint on the one side, intranets in SharePoint and otherwise, and Microsoft Teams as well. So we're going to jump through a lot of these topics, and we're going to look at various aspects of them. Before we do, though, just a moment to kind of take you through a little bit about me and a little bit about my history as well. So I've been in the Microsoft space primarily for going on 25 years, in fact, by now. As Lizanne mentioned, I'm a Microsoft MVP these days for SharePoint, well, for Teams at least, but obviously Teams hasn't been around that long. So previously for SharePoint primarily, and these days, as I said, more focused on Teams. In terms of work, we do a lot of work with global clients, consulting around Teams and Teams adoption, Teams training, and Teams strategy as well, things like rollouts and so on. So you can understand how analytics, for example, plays a big part of that. We also do a lot of work recently with Teams development and customization, so helping customers develop solutions that they've earmarked that they want to build for Teams, effectively to customize Microsoft Teams. And then related to that as well, I'm also the founder of a company called ChitChatter, which you can find at chitchatter.com, where we build a number of add-ins and products to build on the Teams platform as well. So we'll touch on one or two of those as we go through, because they're quite relevant to some of the things that we're talking about in the intranet space. On the side of the screen there, by the way, I've put a number of contact details. So if you're a LinkedIn person or an email person, whatever it is, please feel free to get in touch. And I've got some GitHub links and so on if you want to find me on those channels as well. Okay, with that I'm going to jump into the meat of today's show. So we see. So I'm going to turn the camera off, and we can jump into the actual topics. So to start us off, I'm going to go back in history, and I'm going to go back very far in history to probably about 6 weeks ago or so. Luzana and I had been chatting about the topic and just putting together the invitation for this webcast and et cetera, and we had everything perfectly baked, totally worked out the agenda and the topics and all that kind of thing, when all of a sudden, out of the blue, Microsoft came up with the announcement for Microsoft Viva. So I'm not sure if everybody here is aware of the Viva product or necessarily aware of all of the components of what it contains and what it can do, but certainly it's a very recent announcement from Microsoft from the first week in February, so this is really hot off the presses, and we'll go through some of that as well, but it obviously had a big effect in terms of the topic that we had planned and lined up in the agenda for this talk already. So we took a few days to just kind of digest Viva and what it meant and understand its contents, and we certainly will be covering what it means today, a little bit of a quick run through of Viva itself and how it plays into this topic. But truthfully, the reason I wanted to present the webcast anyway is because the topic is a little bit more broad than simply one product just from Microsoft. So we'll go through some background and some history and some thinking at least, and we'll certainly cover Viva as part of this as well. If we do go back really in history a couple more years, more than just 5 weeks or 5 or 6 weeks, and we do go back a little bit further, I'm sure many of you were aware of the announcement when Microsoft announced Microsoft Teams in the sort of 2016, 2017 timeframe, and they came out with it. And certainly in my mind, back in those days, the distinction was pretty clear. We had SharePoint on the one side for document management, record management, portals and intranets and those kinds of things. And on the other hand, we had this new Teams tool for chatting and video conferencing and video calls and screen sharing and whatnot. And it was pretty clear to me that these were very useful tools, but extremely distinct tools back in those days. So we fast forward a few years now, and we have the idea of discussing Teams and intranets, or Teams as an intranet, something along those lines. But back then, I'm reminded back in those days of the words of a famous song from last century many years ago, and if I paraphrase it, what's Teams got to do with it? It's quite clear that, you know, we have this intranet for one thing and we have Teams for this other thing as well. We can almost say, going back in those days, that, you know, the relationship between the two is kind of like the relationship between, say, I don't know, lemonade and bicycles, which is to say absolutely no relationship at all. However, as I thought more and more about the topic, and as we used Teams and helped customers with Teams and continued helping customers with SharePoint and intranets and whatnot over the years, it became more and more clear to me that there certainly is a scope for seeing how these things could work together and potentially looking at ways to make them work together in as effective a manner as possible. Somehow Microsoft read the thoughts out of my head, sucked them out, and came up with the idea of this Microsoft Viva, which, as I said, we will definitely touch on later in the webinar. But before we do, let's just understand what we mean when we're saying an intranet, though, because it has different meanings to different people and different purposes depending on where you're coming from. In terms of terminology, I mean, there really is, to a large extent, really neither here nor there. Some people call it an intranet, others call it a portal, some call it a corporate portal or an intranet portal, or more recently digital workplace or workspace, as we stopped going to work as a place last year. Really, all of these terms, to a large extent, talk about what we're calling the intranet in this topic. So perhaps more important than the name is just understanding what do we mean when we're looking at the concept of a portal and implementing it, for example, in the Microsoft world. And fundamentally, there are 3 questions we need to ask. We need to understand why, what is the purpose of the intranet, because that will speak to how we might want to implement certain aspects of it in Teams or not. We'll look at what comprises the internet, what are we actually sort of talking about in terms of content and structure and so on, and ultimately, how would we implement it? And this, to a large extent, we'll talk about tools. So if we jump into this question a little bit more, I've got a slide here which is very similar to a slide that I've been presenting to customers many years ago. I look back in some old customer slide decks, and about 8 or 10 years ago I had a slide very similar to this. And what this was speaking to was, what was the purpose of your intranet? So if we've got called in to discuss the opportunity to produce an intranet with a client, we'd want to understand what are the things that they're trying to achieve, what are the goals of their intranet. And typically it would boil down into one or more of these 8 things. So some customers want 2 or 3, some would want 5, someone might want all 8 in terms of what they're understanding at that point in time, what they're wanting the intranet to be. Is it for storing and managing documents and records? Is it about knowledge management, for example, which might give quite a different spin on how we approach the intranet? There's a lot of productivity and effectiveness and forms and workflow and different kinds of communication that can take place as well. So these are traditionally the reasons of why we might look to implement an intranet. But building on that, there's another way to look at it, and that's to consider the what of an intranet. Once we understand why we're building it, we have to understand what the different content is that comprises this notion or this thing that we refer to as an intranet. So typically there's some kind of content. There needs to be something there for people to want. And again, depending on which of those sort of squares you're looking at, this typically falls into things like policies, wikis, birthdays and events, for example, FAQs, forms and workflows and so on, some kind of company news, for example. So there's certainly an element of that we need the actual content itself to present. On the other hand, though, we need to be able to present that content. So that's talking things like landing pages, perhaps embedding certain content, like if you have an LMS, for example, you might want to embed some training material into that portal, for example. So there's ways to surface it, pages, widgets, web parts as we know them in the SharePoint world, for example, things along those lines. And then a little bit in between, aside from the things that we present on the pages, there needs to be an ability for people to find the content. So fundamentally, that's talking about things like navigation, menus and whatnot, some kind of search capability, and in some cases also things like audience targeting. So different people might see different weather based on what city they're in or what country they're in. Obviously, the weather would be location dependent. And those we've found typically to be the three sort of primary pillars of what comprise an intranet. In recent years, we sometimes have a little notion of an other on the side. For example, 10, 15 years ago, maybe we had only the first three, but more recently we've perhaps had things like Yammer or Enterprise Social and wanting to integrate that into the intranet as well. But fundamentally, those three on the left side are the main reasons or the main components, shall we say, of an intranet. And another way we typically look at this with clients is by looking at what we call a content pyramid here. So this is an idea. The pyramid represents the volume of content, of unstructured content in an organization. So these aren't things like purchase orders and actual transaction structured content. These are unstructured content in terms of documents, PDFs, things along those lines. And in terms of the volume, at the bottom we have the largest amount is the stuff that users store themselves. In between we have team and sort of collaboration content around working together on projects. And at the top we have the company stuff. So this would be things like company policies, those news and whatnot. And typically the answer of how we would approach this, say, 10 years ago, something along those lines in the Microsoft world, was very straightforward. The answer to everything was SharePoint. I'm not sure who's worked in the space necessarily for a long time, but I'm sure many of you have, and you'll remember those days SharePoint was the spray can, so to speak, that we sprayed on everything. In fact, we used to present slides like this to customers as well, that SharePoint really was a everything and the kitchen sink kind of a tool. Microsoft had shoved everything in there, videos and digital asset management and wikis and everything that you could possibly want. Microsoft tried to shove a version of SharePoint in for that. However, Microsoft themselves learned over time that wasn't great. SharePoint was a jack of all trades and master of none kind of a product in those days. It was good at some things, but it certainly wasn't great at all of those kind of things. So Microsoft changed the product landscape to a large extent around those times. And if I look at it chronologically, so to speak, not necessarily in order of the hierarchy, but in order of what we had at the time, SharePoint remained, and to a large extent still remains, for the presentation of corporate content up at the top. But down at the bottom we had the introduction of OneDrive. Now, to a large extent, it uses SharePoint as an engine under the covers, but it's a different tool, it's a different branding, it's a sync tool, etc., etc. So there's a different product that comes in from Microsoft to do all this stuff at the bottom. And then even at the top, we had the introduction of Yammer to handle a lot of corporate intranet communication and interaction in various directions as well. And then most recently, of course, as we all know, we had the introduction of Microsoft Teams to focus on that team stuff in the middle, hence the product name, as we can all imagine. However, if we look from an intranet perspective and we look at this as an overall landscape in terms of the pyramid effectively, what we start to see is that the landscape is changing as we start to merge into Microsoft Teams, and we see some of the bits and pieces starting to work a little differently. So I'm sure all of you have seen that in Teams we have a Files tab, and one of the components in that Files tab is your OneDrive content. So not only do we have OneDrive behind the scenes, but we can see some of that data appearing inside of Microsoft Teams, and likewise we have the SharePoint content surfaced behind files in chat, for example. But there's more to it than that as well. If we go into, for example, a group chat, and we go ahead and share a file in the group chat by dragging it into the Files tab, then albeit that it's part of the chat, that content needs to go somewhere. In a Teams team, that can go into the SharePoint site, but in a group chat, that file needs to go somewhere, and it ultimately goes into OneDrive. So we see Teams starting to surface that note, that content that's stored in OneDrive, Teams being the user interface around that. Similarly, notes, for example, if we go ahead and create a new wiki note inside of a Teams meeting, that content will ultimately get stored into the OneDrive behind the scenes. So if we go and have a look at our corporate OneDrive in this demo tenant, we'll see things like Microsoft Teams chat files, which are the files we looked at before, Teams data, recordings most recently have started going into OneDrive as well. So ultimately, Teams is starting to become a surfacing area for a lot of the content that is inside of OneDrive. So if we look at it from the perspective here, and I'm going to take that square on the right off really to focus on these primary three areas. We see in the Microsoft space that we are storing content in these set of tools, and we're surfacing it traditionally in these tools over time as well, but we're starting to see that OneDrive content move. If we look at it from the perspective of the pyramid, Teams is starting to dig downwards and take over some of the role of OneDrive from a presentation perspective. So the question becomes, well, is Teams moving upwards and perhaps overtaking some of the presentation role of some of those other products as well? And the answer to that absolutely is yes, in the same way. So for example, we saw in recent months Microsoft introducing something called the Communities app inside of Teams, and as the Yammer logo on there implies, this is nothing other than the Yammer experience embedded into Microsoft Teams. And I don't have a particularly good demo of that in the environment that I'm looking at there, so I just took a screenshot of another one. But basically exactly what we saw there, that the user lives inside of Teams, but there's an app that's ultimately embedding the Yammer content into the Teams experience. So Teams, again, sort of moving up that pyramid in terms of the presentation layer. And does that happen in terms of SharePoint? Well, we have here an announcement from late 2020 from the Microsoft team, in particular announcing something called the Home Site app for Microsoft Teams. And as it says there, the idea is to bring your home site and the best of your intranet directly into Microsoft Teams. So they had some screenshots at that time, and effectively what we're looking at again is an app inside of Teams, as you can see on the left bar, and essentially bringing your SharePoint home site directly into Microsoft Teams. However, this announcement was sort of September of 2020. We didn't hear much about it, but they did commit around that time to sort of launch this SharePoint Home app in the March 2021 timeframe. But instead of that happening, what we had early February was this announcement of Microsoft Viva. So this is the point in the presentation when we're actually going to unpack what Viva is, what it means, and have a quick look at what it contains and ultimately what features it brings to the table, so to speak. What I've done in the bottom here is I've put a link to a great article that came out basically the same week that Microsoft announced Viva. This is a particular individual that they were working with, so he obviously had some background information, but he's got a great blog that just describes the idea behind Microsoft releasing the concept of this Viva tool. And effectively what Microsoft referred to Viva as is an employee experience platform, an EXP. And according to Josh Burson, his idea here is that the 80s and 90s were sort of principally represented by the ERP sort of software in the corporate space. We had the next sort of block of time represented by the idea of the CRM being a dominant player in the corporate space, and EXP is ultimately, in his perspective, what's going to drive the next 10 or 20 years of primary corporate app focus. So that's a bit of background to Viva. What you'll see inside of a lot of the Viva marketing, though, is 4 primary target areas, effectively, of what Microsoft Viva is aiming to accomplish. So just reading left to right there, we have the idea of culture and communications as a sort of a pillar of what Viva is trying to achieve, productivity and well-being, people and expertise, and finally skill and growth. Now, the reason Microsoft focuses on these 4 sort of primary target areas, if you like, is because each of these ultimately maps to a particular component in the Viva family. This is important to be aware of. Microsoft Viva is not a product in the same way that, let's say, SharePoint or Teams or Yammer or anything like that are a product. Viva is essentially a brand of employee experience tools that ultimately manifest as 4 separate apps right now inside of Microsoft Teams. And I say right now because this is what we've been presented at this point, but it's entirely possible maybe in 6 or 12 months, for example, that there could be Pillar 5 and Pillar 6 represented by other apps. And if we look at what these are, and again, I'm going to do a very quick run through. The focus of this talk is not to be Viva entirely, but I think it's an important component of the idea of Teams and Intranet. So I'm going to take you through a really whirlwind tour of these 4 components and that comprise Viva and what they ultimately mean. I'm going to focus on connections because in some ways that sort of primarily touches on the idea of the intranet. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start on the right and move towards the left in terms of topics that we're going to cover. So if we look at learning first in terms of skilling and growth, and we look at the actual Microsoft Viva Learning product, essentially what it is, again, as I've said with all of these, if you install Viva Learning, you don't get all of these installed by default with Teams. You need to go ahead and install Learning, install topics, etc., depending on what you might want to make use of as an organization. But when you install the Viva Learning capability, what you're doing is you're installing an app into Teams. You'll see there's a tab along the top to focus on your individual learning, for example. And ultimately what Viva Learning does is it surfaces content from different providers into Microsoft Teams. So if you have a subscription to LinkedIn Learning or Coursera or edX, for example, in these screenshots, what it will do is it will surface that content into Microsoft Teams. And it is extensible, so you can have your own content areas, if you like. In this Contoso, fictional Contoso company, for example, they may have a lot of their own video training that they want to incorporate as well. And the idea is you can bring all of this content together and sort of present the training content. If we look at an individual item, for example, we see an image and a title, but also things like the number of views, the number of likes, etc., etc. Not quite sure what's behind those 3 dots yet. This is just an early screenshot. But presumably we will have things like the ability to subscribe to a course, etc., etc. Important to know, though, this is not simply producing a blank list of everything out of that provider. So if we looked at LinkedIn Learning on the bottom there, for instance, it's not taking every course from there. This is a curated set of content. So it's the learning and development manager in your organization, for example, deciding what he wants or she wants to focus on as the content for Contoso, for instance, in this example, and the content that should be presented and promoted to users. It's also possible to go ahead and embed a Viva Learning tab into another area. So let's say an engineering team, for instance, it might make sense to introduce a Viva Learning tab in there and a specific set of focused content specifically for that. Okay, so that's Viva Learning. If we have a look at Viva Topics, then we can have a look at what that contains. And fundamentally what this is a surfacing of something called Project Cortex, which is a knowledge management capability that Microsoft's been introducing and talking about for quite some time. So if you're familiar with Project Cortex, or you're familiar with the more recent announcement called Sharepoint Syntax, not syntax but syntax, which builds on that, essentially those are the underpinnings of the manifestation of Project Cortex, if you like, and the underpinnings of what will become the topics capability inside the Viva Suite. So as an example here, the user is hovering over a word. Teams client has identified that this SOAR, this SOAR, is an acronym that is of relevance inside of the knowledge base. It will highlight the word, the user can hover over it, and it will bring up what's called a topic card here inside of Microsoft Teams. So the user can see some important knowledge relating to this particular knowledge base item. They can go ahead and click View Details, and what will happen is, once again, they will move into another app inside of Teams, which is the Topics app, where they can go ahead and get a full detailed topic experience around this particular SOAR topic, for example. So that's the next component inside of Microsoft Viva. If we look at moving along, we've looked at Viva Learning, we've looked at Viva Topics. If we look at Viva Insights, essentially what this is it's insights into the workplace environment. As Microsoft refers to it, a productivity and well-being tool. And the goal here essentially is to make sure that people are working as effectively as possible. So this means things like, if you're familiar with a lot of the analytics and so on we've had for several years now in the Office or Microsoft 365 space, helping us be more effective with meetings and so on, it's talking to that as well, and it's surfacing some of that data, saying if we're spending too much time in meetings, for example, if the meetings and teams and whatnot are being effective. So that's one aspect from a productivity side. But a big part of it as well is around the well-being as well. It's trying to help you as an individual be more mindful and productive and well, essentially, especially in these work-from-home times. I think about my wife, for example, who has to transition in 1 minute from being a corporate executive to being a gourmet chef, making meals for the children, for example. So that transition can be very stressful, and part of what Viva Insights does is help with the well-being in terms of introducing things like mindfulness and mindful meditation tools, for example, through third parties like Glint and whatnot, and introducing that into the overall employee experience. For managers and senior executives, we also see things like identifying people or teams or individuals that are potentially working too hard and looking to burn out. So Insights, like all the other Viva app services, as an app on the left menu, we have certain things that are focused on us, like, for example, introducing protected time to make sure you don't get meeting requests, but also that you don't get notifications from chat notifications from Teams and so on during that time. And then for managers and higher level senior executives in the organization, there are options there as well to, again, see things like employee burnouts, which teams are working too hard, which teams are having too many meetings after hours, things along those lines. So those are three of the components of Viva. The last component is what's called Viva Connections. And Viva Connections, as with the others, manifests as an app inside of Microsoft Teams. And for those of you who are thinking, this looks quite similar to that SharePoint home site app that we saw before, well, this is effectively exactly that. So we have the app experience inside of Microsoft Teams, and then we have on the central panel the actual content coming from somewhere, principally SharePoint, and there's a few other things we'll talk about a little bit later. So that was a really, really quick run through of Microsoft Viva. Of course, there's a lot more content available from Microsoft themselves. There's various videos and documents and PDFs and web pages and so on. If it's a topic that's interesting to you, there's of course tons of content from them as well, but I wanted to make sure to at least cover it. It's a very fresh topic and obviously quite key in terms of understanding the idea of Teams and intranets. In terms of understanding the timelines, though, Viva was announced very early in February, the very first week of February 2021, and the early timelines that we started receiving during the month of February were effectively along these lines. So you can see there the idea of Viva Connections being announced as May 2021 during the Build conference. They were targeting a general availability of the desktop version of Connections. I didn't touch on that, but there's a tremendous mobile experience coming as well. Notice that Topics, incidentally, was immediately announced as general availability. So as part of the Viva launch, Topics was immediately generally available. Connections was due to come sometime around May, and notice also things like Insights and Learning and whatnot. Learning in particular was meant to go to private preview at the launch date, and then later on in the year we would have had some sort of general availability. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because the timelines are shifting, and the product suite is moving at a tremendous pace. Since those February announcements, we've already seen that as of Ignite last week, Connections desktop experience is already going into general availability, and Viva Learning public preview has been announced to be released during the course of April. So in very short order, we should see part of that product coming as well. So that's a quick overview of the 4 different product suites. In terms of licensing, though, it's important to know there is some licensing, or there are some licensing implications that are still unfolding. So for example, remember Topics was immediately announced as available at the beginning of February. However, there is a charge to this. So Topics will be charged at a cost of $5 per user per month. So if you're on an E5 plan and paying $20 or $25 or whatever it is, I forget the exact pricing right now, but something like that per user per month, you'd be looking at an additional $5 per user per month. Now, it's a tremendous tool set, an extremely capable knowledge management suite, but it's important to know it's not free to simply go ahead and add that capability. So this was the first product that was announced as general availability, and the first product to have pricing available or announced with it. So it was interesting to see what came afterwards. Connections, as I said, was recently announced, and Connections, however, will have no additional licensing associated to it as well. So the question then becomes, well, what's going to happen with learning and insights from a licensing perspective? But it's really much too early to say. Important to understand, though, in terms of learning, as we saw, you're incorporating additional third parties in there. So you needing a subscription to LinkedIn Learning or edX or something like that, installing Viva Learning isn't going to give you that subscription. You would still need that third-party subscription as well. So whether Microsoft's going to charge an additional fee on top of that, will be very interesting to see. And likewise, Insights, there's some third-party elements in there as well, as I mentioned, things like Lint and whatnot. So again, whether Microsoft decides to charge for that or what they decide to charge, it's too early to say, but it will be most interesting to see. In terms of overall capability, I'm very excited by Viva. I'm very excited to see what Microsoft's going to do with it. I'm excited to see what it does already right now and what the timeframes and ultimate rollouts are going to look like. Microsoft produced, of course, a lot of research and a lot of business justification to explain why organizations might want to look at using Viva. So I've just put a few of them up on the screen here right now, but engaging your employees effectively through a valuable experience effectively means you're going to get more conscious and better off employees, which ultimately should lead to better productivity, things like improved innovation, ultimately higher customer satisfaction as well. So overall, very excited by the idea of Microsoft Teams. And the first, or the three on the right, shall we say, are pretty much very much new capabilities. However, in terms of our coming back to our overall topic for tonight, in terms of intranets with Teams and SharePoint and whatnot, to some extent the Connections product really is the most topical in terms of understanding or coming back to the primary topic that we were having. If we go back to our earlier pillars, and we look again at the what and the how of the intranet, combining the two together, very much historically we would have had the content, the presentation, etc., represented in the products that we see on the right, the SharePoints, the Yamas, and whatnot. So ultimately the internet is around the content, the presentation of that content, and the ability to find it as well. So to some extent, if we look at the Connections app, there is an element of, or an element to me at least, of to some extent trying to shoehorn SharePoint into Microsoft Teams. Now, that's very sort of very clear in terms of them bringing the SharePoint page directly into an app inside of Teams. However, that doesn't make it necessarily a bad idea. It doesn't necessarily make it a good idea either. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think time will tell whether this is an effective approach to bringing the idea of an intranet or bringing the manifestation of an intranet in SharePoint, for example, into Microsoft Teams. If this is the right approach, though, then we do need to be conscious of the fact that we are still bringing a SharePoint page in here. That means we still need things like graphic design, we still need things like UX in terms of working out what makes sense to present to our users in an organization of our size and in our industry, et cetera, and obviously that applies differently to different people on the call. But essentially those are the kind of concerns that we'd look at in terms of bringing an intranet to the user base. And finally, of course, there's the content. We need content planning. Who's going to be producing the news, making sure that it's updated regularly if we're having news, etc. All of those kind of things. So a lot of the traditional concerns and planning and work that we would need to do to create an intranet still remain if we're looking at bringing the intranet into Teams in this kind of manner. Now, that also means, as I mentioned, we need to look at things like UX and UI design in terms of an actual look and feel and colors and all of that kind of great user interface design that we need to make use of. And there are several tremendous third parties in the Microsoft space. So some of you will be familiar with things like Wisdom and LiveTiles and Valo and Bind Tuning and a host of other tremendous and very capable third parties. From the Microsoft space, in the more recent Microsoft timeframe, we have this capability called Lookbook, which is a great set of templates that Microsoft themselves provide that are free and in some cases open source as well, which can also be another lower cost alternative to putting a beautiful intranet experience of some sort together. There's a whole bunch of different types of capabilities and whatnot inside of the Lookbook. But essentially, as I mentioned, this is an approach to bringing a corporate intranet. It's certainly the one Microsoft's chosen from a Viva perspective, and a lot of third-party vendors as well. So some of the names I mentioned, for example, allow you to take their SharePoint intranet and bring it into Teams in a similar kind of manner. But what I want to look at for the rest of the webinar is the last few minutes that we have is potentially looking at completely alternative approaches. Rather than bringing the web page into SharePoint, are there different things that we should be looking at altogether in terms of things like the content and things like the presentation? So even some of those third parties that I mentioned are also looking at things like this as well. Valo, for example, have a very interesting workspaces product inside of Teams, Live Tiles, for instance, have something called Reach. Now, I haven't used these products myself. I can't sort of attest to whether they're any good or not. That's the research you'd have to do. But they're certainly taking an interesting approach to the idea of the intranet inside of Teams. If we look at Reach, for example, we have news and posts and whatnot. Rather than embedding the SharePoint page, they're sort of leveraging a Teams tab experience and leveraging Teams experiences in a more native Teams way, shall we say. So that's one approach to doing things a little differently in Teams, but I want to show you also some other ideas of potentially how we could manifest the concepts of an intranet, if not directly embedding SharePoint into Teams, but potentially introducing the concept of an intranet inside of Microsoft Teams. So one way, for instance, to do that is to have a team in Teams that represents the intranet. So in this fictitious Contoso company, for example, I might have a Contoso intranet team. And some of the things that might look like are, for example, a general channel, which of course we get, and it's perhaps a place to send important announcements. And if we look at a sample division, for example, we might have, let's say, a compliance team, and compliance might have files that they want to represent, so compliance typically do in terms of things like policies and whatnot. We could use the Files tab to do that, but we could also use some other alternatives and for example, embed a SharePoint search page, so a search-based application, and effectively create a beautiful compliance document portal with policies and whatnot, all the sort of the different documents that comprise compliance that we need to present to the rest of the organization. So that's one alternative. We might want to have a forms panel. Compliance typically have things like conflict of interest forms and gift registers and whatnot. In this case, I'm using one of our tools, the Quick Links tool, to put a list of relevant links together that sort of comprise the various forms for compliance. Once you might want to use things like the wiki, for example. The idea here is that we're taking what might have been a page in a portal and creating a Teams representation of that. Another example might be doing something like an office-based approach. So for instance, we might have Cape Town or New York, whatever the offices are in our company, and we might again have sort of things that represent that. So maybe there's announcements to people in the Cape Town team, to somebody visiting the Cape Town office. Maybe they might want important links to understand things like the accommodation or food available in the office, or if somebody who's in there might want things like the printers and other facilities, for example. So these are ways we can represent certain capabilities. One of the other things I've done is I've gone and put installed one of our bots inside here, and there's various templates. I'll even show you some free templates from Microsoft to do this kind of thing as well. But in terms of, as a user, for instance, wanting to engage the compliance department, I might go ahead and try and message one of the users or do that directly in chat, somebody from compliance. But what I could do is embed a bot kind of experience so that if somebody wants to ask a question, for example, they might want to ask the compliance bot around a specific policy, then the bot will go ahead and look that up in the knowledge base and be able to answer questions directly to users. So again, this is one way to sort of represent a concept of an intranet directly inside of Teams. So that's a different approach altogether. If that's something that's interesting to you, then I highly recommend looking at the Teams sample apps that Microsoft provides. So you can simply go ahead and Google them, but there's a whole long list of app templates that Microsoft provides. These are free and open source entirely. There are some hosting costs, but essentially the source code is totally free. It's a huge long list here of several dozen apps that Microsoft provides for Teams for free. And some of these will be very interesting in terms of looking at an intranet kind of space. So for example, there's something called the Company Communicator, the ability to message users inside of Teams. There's a celebrations app, for example, if you want to have birthday and anniversary and other kinds of events inside there. The Icebreaker app, for example, which connects users together to enable them to meet one another, for instance, are great capabilities to do things like that. There's also a Q&A engine, FAQ+, which again is a totally free app that Microsoft provides, which would let you do something like that, that compliance bot that we looked at a moment ago. So these are another way to sort of look altogether at intranets or at portals inside of Microsoft Teams. And the last idea I'm going to leave you with is primarily we've been talking about a main portal or a central intranet inside of a company. But we all do often sometimes have, or we do in many cases have separate dedicated portals as part of an overall intranet. So we might have things like an innovation portal or ideation portal, something along those lines. We might have something like a learning portal or an onboarding portal, things to that extent. And these two could be represented in certain ways inside of Microsoft Teams. So if we go back to those app templates, for instance, Microsoft has the Great Ideas app inside here, which again is an app fully free and fully Teams embedded experience for doing things like ideation, and likewise there's another one to deal with things like learning, for example. There's a Grow Your Skills app, for example, things along those lines. So another way to look at sub-portals, aside from sort of a higher level primary experience inside of Teams. If we look at another example of that, this again is an app that we built that I thought might be interesting for you to see as well. Part of the SharePoint lookbook is something called the New Employee Onboarding Portal, which again takes a sort of a web content management approach to new employee onboarding. Now this is again part of Lookbook. It's totally free, totally open source, and you can go ahead and provision this in your organization. So it's a new web portal experience for new employees that are going to onboard and join your organization and whatnot. But again, this is a sort of traditional approach. What we've got as part of what our company puts together is something called the Teammate app, which is a new employee onboarding experience 100% embedded inside of Teams. So what users will get, for instance, is an interactive menuing kind of experience to help them browse around and look and understand new content. It also sends them staged messages over the course of days or weeks or months, whatever the organization configures, to send the users drip messages over a period of time rather than try and give them everything they could possibly want to know about in the 2-hour induction meeting that they hopefully need to remember for the next 5 or 10 years. This takes a very different staged approach to content, and then there's a Q&A engine inside of here as well. So users can interact with a knowledge base through this bot as new users trying to find out maybe what certain acronyms mean in the company, or understanding what benefits are available, etc., 24/7 being able to engage with that bot and that experience inside of Teams rather than through a traditional web-based portal. Okay, so that was a quick run through. There's different approaches as we can see. And what I've tried to do here is pitch or approach different ways that we could look at working with intranets inside of Teams. Of course, Microsoft has their view in terms of what Viva's bringing to the table. So that's certainly something to consider, but we've looked at a few others in terms of a Teams team, for instance, or some of those bot and app-based experiences. Overall, though, a few considerations I want to leave you with. Is this even a good idea? I think it's a little early to tell, but you know, I'm conscious of that van packed with a lot of equipment that we saw. Are we trying to shoehorn too much into Teams? Well, it's an interesting consideration. Even if it is a good idea, it might not be a good idea for your organization, for your corporate situation and your company's culture, for example. It may be a bit too bleeding edge. It doesn't mean it's not a great approach, but maybe not right now. So just something to think about as well. Understand also, if we do something like the Teams team, that sort of Contoso net, do be aware that company-wide teams inside of Microsoft Teams, in fact, if that's not something you're aware of, you can create a team that everybody in the company automatically joins. That's called a company-wide team, and that's limited to 10,000 users. So if your company is bigger than that, you know, that particular approach might not work. But if you're smaller than that, then that could be a good approach as well. Some of the things we've looked at would potentially require a mix of different tools, so that again may or may not be a consideration, but something to be aware of. And then also to be aware of a lot of the things we're looking at still require the content to be in SharePoint. If you remember the 3 pillars that we looked at, we were largely looking at Teams as a presentation, for example, in that context. But if we have corporate policies which represent documents and records, you know, those should largely still be stored in the enterprise record management system in the form of SharePoint. A lot of the tools we looked at also that look at a SharePoint home site, so be those Viva Connections or some of the other third parties as well, just to be aware, a lot of those only support one notion of a home page. So if you want maybe one a corporate homepage for each region in your company, or one based on a particular role, for example. Those things will have certain limitations. So just be aware of that as well. And of course, that will also require SharePoint, as we've seen. A lot of those do depend on SharePoint. So ultimately, you do want to still consider, if you're looking at one of these SharePoint-backed solutions, that you of course do still want to look at something like Cardiolog to understand your analytics of where your users are and what they're looking at. Okay, that's pretty much all from me. I just want to say thank you. I hope you all found this useful. I'm happy to hang around for some questions as well, but I put some contact details on the bottom as well. You can get in touch with me by email or LinkedIn or several other channels as well, but those are probably the easiest. So yeah, thank you from me. As I said, I'm happy to hang around for some questions. I hope everybody found this useful and enjoyable and got some good value out of it.
Great, thank you very much, Hilton. Yes, I see that there are a couple of questions. We have a question here from Roger Hastings. Roger wants to know if an organization were looking to build a simple homepage or navigational portal within Teams, in other words, create a where do I find it channel or portal in Teams, what ways might you suggest to try to create something like this without building a SharePoint or Intranet homepage?
So Roger, I don't know if you're still on the call. You can perhaps switch to voice and we can chat about that a little bit. I'm not sure I fully understand the idea. You're looking to have a page kind of experience, but without building the page in SharePoint, or looking to do something without building a web experience altogether.
Another question from Martinez Hamer is asking, already use Microsoft Work Hub app within Teams? I guess it's a question, have you already used Microsoft Work Hub app within Teams?
The Work Hub app? No, I'm not familiar with that one. If you can send a link, I'd love to have a look at that. Is that one of the app templates?
So I'm not sure. That was a question by Martinez.
Yeah.
So we will also reach out to him, and then.
Okay. Sorry, Lizanne, just before we move along, just come back to Roger's question. What might be interesting, I've popped and again, get in touch, Roger, and I can send you the link, but I've popped up an article on the screen which might be interesting. It's basically a way to build something similar to what we've seen. So you could build an internal company app that you could publish to your own internal team, your own internal Teams app store. And it's kind of a similar approach to doing what Microsoft are doing in terms of connections, but it will enable you to build your own version of that. So if you do have a particular page that makes sense to embed as an app in this way, this is a very detailed step-by-step guide to doing something exactly like that. It does involve, some of the development tools for Teams, but there's a very simple guide, and it's really quite step-by-step. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes, even if it's not something that you've done before. The details are pretty straightforward. So I know some of this looks a little scary if you're not a developer, but you really don't need to touch most of it. It's really quite a quick step-by-step guide to doing something like that. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's certainly an alternative.
And then we have one more question here, Hilton. It doesn't show me who the asker is, unfortunately, but the question reads, does Teams have a native traditional LMS, so learning management system, for company training? And the second part of that question, has Viva indicated for anything like this?
So there's no native LMS experience inside of Teams directly. What there is, which is interesting, and to some extent that's exactly what Viva Learning is trying to address. What there is, and in fact Viva Learning, it isn't clear whether Viva Learning is an LMS. In fact, if I go back to the screenshots, essentially what Viva Learning is doing is it's presenting learning content. So if I just full screen that again, it's presenting the learning content. So as I said, it's curated content. So, a learning manager, for example, is deciding what makes sense in the broader context, or if that's embedded into a particular channel or something along those lines. But it's not clear yet that this is, that there's any particular learning management capabilities behind this. It could be something behind the dots. So it might be tracking things and so on. My suspicion is it's not. It's really more, at this point at least, of a content presentation tool. If you're presenting content from LinkedIn Learning and that's curated content, LinkedIn Learning will store things like, have you completed the course? You get your certificates when you complete, for example, through LinkedIn Learning, things along those lines. So my suspicion is it's really more around presenting the content without being necessarily a full-blown a full-blown Teams LMS. However, there are third-party LMS solutions inside of Teams already. So one of the, long-standing ones, for example, that's been around for many years is LMS 365, for instance, who have a standalone learning management solution, and so they've created a Teams-based experience around that. So if you are looking for something a lot more full-blown, you typically be looking at one of these kind of capabilities or partners, shall we say, altogether.
Right. Thank you very much, Hilton. That seems to be all the questions, but we will reach out to all of you again in a day or two and send you this recording, and then you are also able to reach out to us and just respond to that email if you maybe have any more questions that come up, and then you can just ask away and we will be there to answer all of those questions. We're about out of time, so let's just wrap up this session today. A huge thank you to you, Hilton, for joining us today and sharing your expertise and valuable information about intranets and Teams. It was really super interesting, and so the answer to your question, what Teams got to do with it, plenty, but it depends on your organization. Hey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you to you as well, Liz. And I've just want to let you know, for those who are still on the call, I've popped my contact details up as well. So if anyone does want to get in touch, please feel free. And yeah, thank you again to you and Cardiolog for inviting me on. It was a great pleasure and a privilege to be able to present this content.
Great, excellent. So yeah, we will be in touch. We hope you guys will enjoy the rest of your day, and take care. Thanks, Hilton.